day and welcome to Beyond Arctic Frontier Series, Episode 1. I am your host, Aliénor Perfit of the Policy Insights Forum. We are joined today by Miss Marisol Maddox, Senior Arctic Analyst of the Polar Institute from the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars from the United States. Marisol is also an Operational Research Analyst at PolArctic, LLC. In this episode, Marisol will walk you through the Arctic in the 21st century, challenges and opportunities. Marisol, welcome to Beyond Arctic Frontier Series.
Great. Thanks you so much for having me. It's great to be here with you.
It's our pleasure to have you here with us today. So, without further ado, let us dive directly into it. The Arctic is a region of the world that holds a lot of significance, and there's a lot to unpack there, especially given the renewed world media focus on it in recent years, and also the Department of Defense's recently published Arctic strategy. Marisol, could you begin by introducing to our audience the Arctic region, notably in the geographical, environmental, and geopolitical sense?
Okay, sure. Yeah, and there's obviously a lot to unpack there, but just to kind of give that brief overview, from a geographical perspective, there are actually multiple definitions of what exactly is the Arctic based on different agreements, but there are only ever 8 Arctic states that have territory above the Arctic Circle, which is around 66 degrees north. So kind of the standard across all of those different slight definitions is that constant. And that is significant because for historical purposes, the Arctic region has largely been governed by the Arctic states because most of the Arctic actually falls within national jurisdiction. And so the actual international space, the high seas portion of the Arctic Ocean is quite small. And so just to clarify, the 8 Arctic states are the United States because of Alaska, though we often have to remind people in the lower 48 that we are indeed an Arctic state.
Yes.
We have Canada, of course, Greenland, so a part of the Kingdom of Denmark, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia, of course. So those are like kind of technically the Arctic states. We're talking about, like I said, 66 degrees north and above. And beyond that, there's a lot of different ways to think about the Arctic. It's generally perceived by those who don't know the region super well as an uninhabited place that is full of ice and polar bears. And there's really kind of that mismatch between the perceptions of the region and the fact that it is home to 4 million people. And there's a real difference also between the North American Arctic, which is, the Alaska, Canada, Greenland part from like a tectonic plate perspective versus the European Arctic. So that is like much more modernized. If you go to Tromsø, for instance, in the Norwegian Arctic, it's a city, a fully modern European city. And so there's a real kind of difference there. From a strategic perspective, going back, in history, the Arctic has always had that strategic geography. The United States has had an air base that's now a space base in the northwestern part of Greenland, now called Pituffik. That was really important for refueling air flights previously. And the Arctic now, especially as we have the development of long-range precision strike capabilities, it's really critically important for being able to defend North America. And so especially with the advent of hypersonic and ballistic missiles, one of the big priorities from a defense perspective is that the cooperation with NORAD and being able to modernize NORAD to be able to detect and track and stop any of those types of missiles if we were in the situation that was a thing. And then the other, like the really primary reason that the region is becoming so much more complicated is because of it opening up because of climate change. So the Arctic is warming 4 times faster than the global average. And that has tremendous implications, not just for the Arctic region and its inhabitants, but also for the world, because there's a kind of a tag phrase, which we all know, which is what happens in the Arctic does not stay in the Arctic. Mm-hmm. And that's very true when it comes to things like sea level rise, potential extreme weather events, and some very significant global climate tipping points that are of concern.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that very broad and strategic overview of the Arctic. This actually makes me want to dive maybe a little bit more deeper into the importance of security in that space, because I know security can be understood in a variety of different sectors. So it's not just physical security, you're safe in your home, but there's also environmental security. Talked a little bit about climate change, really, and its impact on the Arctic environment. What would you say would be the broader implications of that, especially if the Arctic is warming 4 times faster than the normal average? What implications would it have for countries that are in the Arctic space, but also others that are not in this space but will be impacted by it?
Yeah, so climate change and the really dramatic ways in which it's manifesting is really challenging the way that we think about security. And it's challenging the structures and mechanisms that we have for being able to deal with security threats because of that actorless nature, right? So as climate change is advancing, the root cause is, it's acutely about the carbon, but it's really about the dominant way of being in the world that is not actually conducive to longevity because it's been associated with this huge, emissions inputs into the atmosphere. Mm-hmm. And so if we really want to be able to deal with this threat, which is, called an actorless threat, because you can't deter it, you can't compel it, you have to actually deal with the root cause if you want to stop it. So it really takes us out of the normal way of thinking about an actor-based threat where you could deter them or compel them, negotiate with them, right? There's no negotiating with the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. So in that way, it's really a challenge for the traditional security apparatus to take this on. And our militaries do have a role to play, but this really then actually needs to be a whole of society effort in addressing those root causes. And then, for the actual Arctic region, as the region is opening up, you have new opportunities, right? So there's opportunities for as fish are moving more towards the polar regions. There's a longer season for tourism, but at the same time, the way that our search and rescue capabilities and kind of forward operating bases have been developed was on this idea that the Arctic Ocean was a frozen ocean that wasn't a blue water ocean where people are actually in the water. And mm-hmm. So there's a real civil security dimension here in terms of the ability to detect an incident and respond in a timely way, especially if it comes to search and rescue, or if there's some type of oil spill. That would be an absolute nightmare for the Arctic. So there's kind of that dimension of it. And then at the same time, we have permafrost, which has been normally permanently frozen ground that has this active layer at the very top that would thaw a little bit in the summer, but the deeper sections would stay frozen. And as the region is warming, the permafrost is thawing, and that is a really serious threat for all sorts of infrastructure, for critical infrastructure, for the people of the Arctic, for military bases, but also for actually our carbon budget. And the amount of wiggle room that we have in order to kind of stick to those Paris Agreement targets, because there's a lot of methane, especially, that is being released from the permafrost as it's thawing, and that's contributing then to the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And methane in particular is a greenhouse gas of concern because it's very potent, and so it has a much greater warming factor in the near term than carbon dioxide per molecule. So there's kind of a couple different ways to think about that.
I wanted to go back maybe a little bit more on what you were mentioning earlier about the different opportunities for the local populations that live in the Arctic, with the ocean thawing, if you will, and becoming more navigable, and the different species of fish and other animals that will come to inhabit more these regions. What strategies could we be employing transnational way to really ensure the economic sustainability for these remote communities, especially there's a lot of indigenous communities that live in this area of the world. Well, the Sami people, the Inuit here in Canada as well, for instance. How can we balance developing their economic benefits, local development, without hurting the environment as much, and trying to preserve it for future generations to come?
Yeah, well, so when it comes to fish, it's interesting because the trend is that fish are migrating away from the equatorial region more towards the poles, but there are a lot of challenges associated with that as well, just from a kind of, fish thriving perspective. So it's not like they're just migrating and everything's great, right? We have research recently that came out showing that their populations are actually dropping as they're moving towards the polar regions. We also have the Arctic Ocean acidifying about 4 times faster than the global ocean average. And that's kind of like the average for the Arctic Ocean. But again, it's important to note that the Arctic Ocean is not homogeneous. So there's certain areas where you have really high levels of ocean acidification, which is a direct result of the ocean absorbing the carbon emissions that we've been releasing, right? So that's one of those things that will be a real challenge, and that research is kind of looking at as the fish are moving and as the oceans are acidifying. How does that affect the species that can live there? We have, of course, new predator-prey dynamics. Off the coast of Alaska, we have really the loss of the cold pool that has traditionally served as a barrier to keeping the fish from the Pacific out of the Arctic Ocean. And so as you lose that, as the ocean's warming, you're getting, new predator-prey dynamics, new types of disease, you're getting heat stress, right? So we had the 10 billion snow crabs that died off the coast of Alaska because of a marine heat wave event. So this is where we need to be thinking about this in multiple ways. So what are the tools that we have to understand how fisheries may evolve, and how can we use policy tools to make sure that we're really more effectively countering things like IUU fishing, ghost gear, all these things that contribute to stress. But also looking at the kind of that evolution of fisheries, and what are the tools that we have for, keeping working waterfronts alive, for making sure that indigenous communities and local populations have that source of food security and economic security. But we also really need to be thinking about tools like marine carbon dioxide removal. And there's some really interesting research there, because essentially, even if we reduce emissions and start sequestering carbon from the atmosphere, that will not deal with the issue of ocean acidification and the warming of the ocean. So that actually needs to be treated separately. And there's some really interesting research there, even on the potential use of kelp in sequestering carbon, and really kind of looking at those multifunctional solutions that, something like kelp, there's no inputs that are necessary to grow it. It provides habitat for fisheries. It sequesters carbon, right? It supports biodiversity. It's kind of part of what's called regenerative mariculture. So I think that is a really cool area for research, but also kind of with my private sector hat on, with the work I'm doing with PolArctic LLC. That's an Alaska Native company that is an oceanographic and data science company that uses artificial intelligence and machine learning to create tailored products for the Arctic. And one of the things that we're looking at is looking at this environmental modeling and agent-based modeling through a grant that we have through the National Science Foundation to understand how species are changing with climate change and what are some of those new opportunities for communities. And if you can kind of create models of the agents of different species, and you can introduce something like counterfactuals, which are like what if scenarios, and do things like introduce a change in pH or water temperature or a combination of factors to then see how they will respond. And that can lead to better management. And that's something that, we want to be working on both in Canada and Alaska.
Well, that's a wonderful work that you're doing right there. Speaking of, actually, your last point led me to another point I wanted to develop maybe a little bit more. I know, well, the Arctic obviously is an international area in the sense that there are many different state actors that are, what's it called? Acting in this area, if you will. That are playing in the Arctic sphere. How would you see international cooperation in this sense and trying to advance in this domain? Because on the other international security hats more at the state level, I know there's obviously the different conflicts that are going on around the world, different competition between state actors, and that has an effect sometimes on the work that international organizations do to try to preserve the Arctic wildlife and play in this international space that is part of the Arctic Ocean, if you will. Would you be able to share maybe a little bit of your thoughts on this topic?
Yeah, so Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 was incredibly harmful, not only for Ukraine, which of course is like bearing the brunt of this like incredibly brutal invasion, but it's harmful to Russia, to the Russian people, and it's very harmful to all of the cooperative efforts that we had and that we were in the process of developing to be addressing many different issues. And so in the fall of 2022, the United States released an updated national strategy for the Arctic region. And so that's really like the 10-year plan from the White House level looking forward. And in that, cooperation with Russia is described as virtually impossible because of not wanting to, condone what Russia has done to make them realize that there are consequences for violently invading peaceful neighbors. And so we have to be looking at, we're living at a time where we have very serious actor-based threats, from Russia, from North Korea, from China, from Iran. But at the same time, we're dealing with catastrophic climate change that is no longer a future generation issue. This is here now. And so we have to be able to do both, right? And so basically, when it comes to things like scientific research, to be understanding the ways that the Arctic is changing and what are the tools that we have to do something about it, to support Arctic biodiversity, to support really sustainable economic development. We have to not lose any momentum with the loss of partnership with Russia. So we have to just look for other opportunities. Some of the examples I've seen are with things like permafrost monitoring for looking at emissions. Some of those sites that were going to be looking at Russia then moved over to Canada, right? And that was from like a US-based research entity. So I think there's a lot of ways in which we can then shift efforts, and there's so many places where we need to make progress. So it's just kind of reorienting our priorities and finding ways to move forward. And I really am really encouraged by that cooperation, because there's so much opportunity. And through that cooperation, we help to kind of solidify those bonds and really reinforce things like democracy, which are so important for being able to, move forward in a peaceful way.
Stemming from, what we just said and developing more the international cooperation aspect of things, I know there's a lot that is being done in between the different Arctic nations in North America, but also on the European side of it. And both regions are not developed exactly the same way, as you alluded earlier. Also, having traveled there a little bit on my own, I know there are differences between the two. How would you say that we can, pull on these different links between nations and try to learn in the best way possible from all the best, not case scenarios, but the different, best practices from different countries who are more used to operating at that level in the north, or also, the local populations who have always lived in this sort of terrain, and they know how to deal with, well, I want to say navigate the frozen waters of the Arctic, and really doing these different types of linkages, because going from north to north is sometimes challenging logistically, and usually the linkages are more north-south. How would you say can we help to develop more this Arctic Circle, for lack of a better word?
Yeah, so again, I think there's so many different opportunities across the different sectors, but for things like military cooperation, of course, that's where exercises are so important. That being able to embed some of our, military from one country into another country's military to really be able to get those insights. I know like the United States has done that, putting some Marines that are embedded with even the UK Royal Marines, who had really maintained their Arctic operational exercises in the Norwegian Arctic, so that we can learn from them in terms of things like the materials that we need and just the changes in behavior, because things that you just assume will work, because they work in other parts of the world, then you take them to the Arctic and all of a sudden, they just don't work, right? Batteries die, lubricants don't work. You accidentally bring a gun inside from the frigid cold, and then you bring it back out in the morning and you break it because you've gotten ice that has built up inside. And so things like that you just have to kind of learn kind of the hard way. But, if you can take those best practices from people who've maintained that operational capability, it saves us a lot of time and money and effort. And we've even seen that now with Finland and Sweden in NATO. The Nordic response exercise, that big NATO response, the NATO exercise. I know like that was a really interesting one in terms of looking at the logistics of how would you reinforce Finland and Sweden as the more inland nations, because of Norway having the coast, that resupply capability, and from a logistics standpoint is kind of complicated. So that's a really important thing to be exercising. But then also, there was the recent announcement about Ice Pact, which is that agreement between the United States, Canada, and Finland to be, looking at ice breaking in particular, which obviously for the United States, that's been a real sore spot since we have our two icebreakers that are just aging, getting older every year, and the Polar Security Cutter program keeps getting delayed. And so that the time frame in which we can actually get another icebreaker for the Arctic for self-rescue capability, and the icebreakers are the primary U.S. surface presence in the region. So for power projection, for being able to respond to incidents, we need to have that. And it's also, of course, about the support infrastructure, which is another kind of key component. But so that agreement between U.S., Canada, and Finland, we'll see what comes of it. I'm really hoping that we get some real meat out of it. But basically, over the next 6 months, there's going to be work to develop a memorandum of understanding about like what that will actually look like. And to be decided, we'll see. But there's a lot of potential there to be working, for the United States to be working with Canada and with Finland, who obviously has an incredible icebreaker construction capability.
Absolutely, absolutely. Marisol, do you have, maybe before we conclude, any parting thoughts that you would like to leave with our listeners today?
Yeah, so I guess I would say like two things. Like one, just from the US-Canada relationship perspective, I think there's just so much opportunity to strengthen cooperation across many different domains between the US and Canada. I mean, first of all, just even from a climate perspective, in terms of the carbon footprint, like with trade, with travel, like we're close together. And so it's just from the carbon footprint perspective, it makes sense. But then also just things like our shared fisheries, wildland fire. There's a great initiative that's being taken up by the Arctic Council that's co-led by Gwich'in Council International, which is one of the indigenous groups in the Arctic, the permanent participants. And that's really important for ecosystem-based management to be able to, ideally harmonize policy in regions where, national boundaries are not respected by nature or by the way that fish move or things like that. And then also from a defense perspective, in the updated Department of Defense Arctic strategy from the United States, the Canada and NORAD are really important, and it's explicitly mentioned that DoD is going to be prioritizing efforts in the North American Arctic with Canada. So also for things like developing, sensors, looking at communications. There's so many different opportunities there. So I just think that that's a space where I'd love to see kind of more meeting of minds and really trying to bring more efforts into fruition. And I know also in the implementation plan for the US's national strategy for the Arctic region, there were a few ideas that were explicitly articulated, including an expanded US-Canada Arctic dialogue that will address shared interests, including around sustainable economic development. So I think it's a really exciting space to watch. And I guess I would just kind of further just back that up by saying that, we're living in a totally different world than we were even 20 years ago. And so I think that, the status quo really isn't an option. We have to find a way forward. And we're in this window of opportunity to be shaping what that looks like in a way that's conducive to future prosperity. And I really feel like if we kind of rise to that challenge and don't minimize like how serious things are, but still, look at what are the options for moving forward in a positive way, it's something that, only has benefits, right? And so I think that that's something we just need to really like energize and, hopefully work together more on.
Marisol, thank you for joining us on the podcast, for the excellent conversation, and for sharing your thoughts on the Arctic today in the 21st century and the challenges it faces, as well as the opportunities that are before us. To our listeners, thank you for joining us for episode 1 of Beyond Arctic Frontiers, brought to you by the Policy Insights Forum. Stay tuned for the upcoming episode 2, which will feature a deeper dive into the Arctic maritime and security infrastructure and its challenges and innovations.